Right now, a video is circulating with a thumbnail showing a blazing, cracked, hellish version of Venus, drenched in dramatic red filters, with a title promising that the James Webb Space Telescope just captured something shocking or terrifying, or too disturbing to ignore. It has racked up views. People are sharing it, commenting on it, genuinely believing it. And here's the problem. It never happened. And by the very physics and engineering of the $10 billion telescope in question, it fundamentally cannot happen, no matter how. Many times the claim gets reposted under a slightly different title. Not won't, not hasn't gotten around to it yet. Cannot, full stop, by design. To understand exactly why requires going back to a single, precise moment in January 2022, when engineers on Earth watched a spacecraft nearly 1 million miles away unfold a structure the size of a tennis court, in a sequence so delicate and so irreversible that a single failure would have ended the mission before it ever captured a single image. That structure is the entire reason Venus, our closest planetary neighbor, remains permanently physically off limits to the most powerful telescope humanity has ever built. And once you understand exactly why, the real story turns out to be considerably more fascinating and considerably stranger than the fake one, currently racking up views. Well, let's start with exactly what these viral videos are claiming, because it helps to understand precisely what's being sold before taking it apart. The pitch usually goes something like this. James Webb, the telescope that gave the world those stunning, awe-inspiring deep space images beginning in the summer of 2022, supposedly turned its enormous golden mirror toward Venus and captured something nobody expected. Dramatic narration promises revelations, discoveries, results, too disturbing to ignore. It sounds exciting. It is also, as far as anyone can verify, completely fabricated. Here is the actual, well-documented, publicly explained truth. James Webb cannot see Venus. This isn't a secret buried in some obscure technical manual. It is one of the very first things any working astronomer will tell you if you ask what Webb can and cannot observe, and NASA itself has explained this publicly on multiple occasions. To understand why, you first need to understand exactly where Webb actually sits in space and how its entire design revolves around that location. Unlike the Hubble Space Telescope, which orbits fairly close to Earth, roughly 340 miles up, James Webb does not orbit our planet at all. Following its launch on December 25, 2021, aboard a European Ariane 5 rocket from French Guiana, Webb spent nearly a month traveling outward before arriving on January 24, 2022, at a location in space called the second Lagrange point, universally shortened to L2, roughly 1.5 million kilometers from Earth, nearly 1 million miles away. That's about 4 times farther out than the Moon. At L2, the combined gravitational pull of the Sun and Earth allows a spacecraft to essentially hover in a stable position relative to both, maintaining the same general orientation as Earth swings around the Sun throughout the year. It's a remarkably clever parking spot, chosen very deliberately for reasons that come down almost entirely to one thing: heat. James Webb is not a telescope built to capture visible light the way your eyes do, or the way an ordinary camera does. It is primarily an infrared telescope, engineered to detect extraordinarily faint heat signatures coming from incredibly distant and incredibly old objects, things like the very first galaxies that formed shortly after the Big Bang, whose light has stretched and shifted deep into the infrared portion of the spectrum after traveling for more than 13 billion years. To pick up signals that unbelievably faint, Webb's instruments have to be kept extraordinarily cold, down around minus 225 degrees Celsius, nearing absolute zero. Any stray heat nearby would completely overwhelm the faint infrared glow Webb is straining to detect, the same way spotting a single candle flame becomes nearly impossible if you're standing directly beside a bonfire. That's precisely why Webb was built with a sunshield roughly the size of a tennis court, made of 5 separate layers of a specialized reflective material, each layer thinner than a single human hair, positioned to block heat and light arriving from 3 sources simultaneously: the Sun, the Earth, and the Moon. Webb's mirrors and scientific instruments sit permanently on the cold side of that shield, facing away from all 3 of those warm, bright bodies, while the shield itself faces toward them, absorbing and radiating that heat back out into space rather than letting it reach the telescope's sensitive optics. Deploying that shield ranks among the most complex, nerve-wracking engineering sequences ever attempted on an uncrewed spacecraft. The entire structure had to be folded and compressed tightly enough to fit inside the Ariane 5's payload fairing for launch, then unfolded piece by piece once Webb was safely in space. A process that engineers at the time openly described as involving hundreds of individual release mechanisms, cables, motors, and pulleys, every single one of which had to function correctly in precisely the right sequence, with absolutely no possibility of a human being physically stepping in to fix anything if a single component jammed. The sunshield finished unfolding on January 4th, 2022, and by January 8th, its 5 layers had been fully tensioned into their final taut configuration. An achievement mission engineers celebrated with visible relief, since a failure at that stage could have ended the entire mission before Webb ever captured a single usable image. It worked. And the resulting temperature difference across that shield is almost absurd to think about. One side regularly reaches temperatures over 100 degrees Celsius in direct sunlight, while the opposite side, sitting just a few feet away across the shield's 5 layers, holds steady at nearly minus 230 degrees Celsius. That sustained extreme temperature gradient is precisely what allows Webb's instruments to detect the incredibly faint infrared glow of galaxies, so old and so distant that their light has been traveling toward us since not long after the universe itself began. Now here's the part that makes photographing Venus flatly impossible. Venus, along with Mercury and Earth itself, orbits closer to the Sun than Webb's fixed position and orientation ever allow it to look. Because Webb's sunshield has to remain pointed roughly toward the Sun and Earth at all times in order to keep its instruments protected, the telescope's field of regard, meaning the total patch of sky it's physically capable of observing at any given moment, only covers targets generally located away from the Sun's direction as seen from L2. Venus, being an inner planet, always appears relatively close to the Sun in the sky, no matter when you look. To point Webb's mirror at Venus, engineers would have to physically rotate the entire spacecraft so its unprotected mirror side faced directly toward the Sun and Earth, which would flood the delicate optics and instruments with exactly the kind of heat and light they were specifically engineered to avoid at all costs. This isn't a matter of adjusting a software setting or reprogramming a command sequence. It would mean deliberately exposing multi-billion-dollar, extraordinarily sensitive equipment to precisely the conditions it was built never to face, almost certainly damaging or permanently destroying it in the process. This is also, incidentally, the exact same reason Webb has never photographed Earth or Mercury either. All 3 of these inner worlds sit too close to the Sun from Webb's vantage point at L2 for the telescope to ever safely or physically point at them. It's a hard boundary built into the mission from day one, not a limitation anyone is quietly working around or planning to lift later. The same logic explains something else that regularly confuses people. Why Webb can observe Mars but not Venus or Mercury, even though all 3 are technically inner or near solar system objects. It comes down entirely to angle and distance from the Sun as seen from Webb's specific vantage point. Mars orbits farther from the Sun than Earth does, so from Webb's position out at L2, Mars can appear at a wide enough angular separation from the Sun's glare to fall safely within the telescope's field of regard during parts of its orbit. Venus and Mercury, by contrast, both orbit closer to the Sun than Earth does, meaning they always appear clustered near the Sun's position in the sky no matter when you check, permanently placing them inside the exact zone Webb's shield exists specifically to block. It's a matter of orbital geometry as much as anything else, entirely consistent and entirely predictable, and it has nothing whatsoever to do with Webb simply not having gotten around to observing Venus yet. So what can Webb actually look at within our own solar system? Quite a lot, as it turns out, since clearly its work isn't limited to only the edge of the observable universe. Webb has produced genuinely spectacular imagery and data on Mars, which sits just far enough from the Sun's glare for the telescope to observe it safely. It has captured detailed views of Jupiter, including its faint ring system and glowing polar auroras. It has studied Saturn and its rings in infrared wavelengths that reveal structural details invisible to conventional cameras. It has produced striking 3-dimensional maps of auroras swirling around Uranus, a genuinely exciting result for planetary scientists when it was first released. And it has turned its instruments toward Neptune, capturing views of that distant ice giant's rings with a level of clarity nobody had ever managed before. Beyond the major planets, Webb has also studied asteroids and objects scattered throughout the distant icy Kuiper belt beyond Neptune, the same region that includes Pluto. Webb's solar system research portfolio is real, genuinely valuable, and actively ongoing. It simply categorically excludes Venus, Mercury, and Earth for the exact heat and orbital geometry reasons already described. If James Webb has never looked at Venus and cannot look at Venus, you might reasonably ask whether any spacecraft has actually managed to photograph it up close. The answer is yes. Several have, and their genuine, real results are honestly just as interesting as anything a fabricated headline could invent. Venus has been visited by multiple missions across the decades. The Soviet Venera program, running from the 1960s through the early 1980s, achieved something no other country has ever matched, successfully landing spacecraft directly on Venus's surface and transmitting actual photographs from the ground before the planet's extreme heat and crushing atmospheric pressure destroyed each lander, typically within about an hour or 2 of touchdown. Those images, grainy and strange as they appear today, remain the only surface photographs ever captured from that part of the solar system, showing a rocky, orange-tinted landscape beneath a thick, hazy sky. More recently, NASA's Parker Solar Probe, a spacecraft primarily designed to study the Sun up close, has flown past Venus multiple times as part of a maneuver called a gravity assist, using the planet's own gravity to adjust its trajectory on the way toward the sun. During several of these flybys, Parker's onboard cameras, built to withstand extreme brightness and heat given how close the spacecraft operates to the sun, captured genuinely surprising images showing features of Venus's surface glowing faintly through its thick cloud cover in near-infrared wavelengths, a result scientists hadn't fully anticipated the instrument would be able to detect when it was originally designed. That finding was real, genuinely newsworthy, and published through legitimate scientific channels in a peer-reviewed journal, and it happened without any dramatic clickbait needed to make it worth covering. Before Parker Solar Probe, NASA also sent a spacecraft called Magellan to Venus in the early 1990s, and it remains one of the most successful Venus missions ever flown. Over several years in orbit, it mapped more than 90% of Venus's entire surface using this method, revealing a landscape covered in volcanoes, some among the largest found anywhere in the solar system, alongside strange, cracked terrain formations that planetary scientists still study today to better understand the planet's geological history. That single mission produced far more genuine, detailed information about Venus's surface than any conventional photograph ever could, using a method built specifically to overcome the exact obstacle Venus presents, that its clouds permanently block ordinary visible light from ever reaching the ground below. There's also Japan's Akatsuki spacecraft, which has spent years orbiting Venus and studying its thick, remarkably fast-moving atmosphere, sending back genuine data on the planet's bizarre weather patterns, including a massive, still not fully explained standing wave structure that appears to remain locked in place over one specific region of the planet, even as the surrounding atmosphere itself races around Venus dramatically faster than the solid planet underneath actually rotates. And Europe's earlier Venus Express mission spent several years methodically mapping the planet's atmosphere and surface temperature before its mission eventually concluded. So genuine, independently verified spacecraft observations of Venus exist in real abundance. None of them involve James Webb because James Webb was never physically capable of doing this particular kind of work in the first place. So where does a claim like James Webb just saw Venus for the first time actually come from, if it flatly isn't true? A few likely explanations, and probably some combination of all of them working together. The first comes down to simple economics of online video titles and thumbnails. Space content performs extremely well, especially anything tied to a big, instantly recognizable name like James Webb. And channels chasing views have learned that dramatic, urgent-sounding claims get clicked far more often than accurate. Measured ones ever do. A title like, "Here's what a distant exoplanet's atmosphere might resemble based on new Webb data," simply doesn't carry the same pull as James Webb just saw something terrifying, even when that second, punchier title describes something that flatly never occurred. A second explanation is that some of these videos are quietly built around genuine Webb findings that have nothing to do with our own Venus at all, then relabeled to sound like they do. Webb has, for example, genuinely studied so-called Venus-like exoplanets, meaning rocky worlds orbiting entirely different distant stars that happen to share certain characteristics with our own Venus: hot, possibly cloud-covered, potentially wrapped in a thick, oppressive atmosphere. A legitimate story about one of those distant Venus-like exoplanets can get quietly repackaged with a thumbnail showing our actual familiar Venus, and a title strongly implying Webb studied our own solar system's planet directly, counting on most viewers never noticing the difference between a rocky world light years away and the literal second planet from our own sun. A third possibility is simpler still: plain fabrication with no real underlying story whatsoever, built purely from stock animations, dramatic narration, and a sufficiently scary-sounding claim, since channel chasing views doesn't actually require genuine discovery to produce a video. It just needs enough viewers who never bother checking the facts. Given how clearly documented and how publicly explained the actual reasons behind Webb's inability to observe Venus already are, and given how easy that explanation is to verify with a basic search, that third explanation genuinely deserves real skepticism from anyone tempted to trust a video like this at face value. It's honestly worth pausing to appreciate just how strange it is that this particular myth manages to spread as widely as it consistently does, because the real, verified explanation, once you actually hear it, is genuinely far more interesting than the fabricated story currently replacing it in so many people's feeds. A telescope engineered with a sunshield the size of a tennis court, parked nearly 1 million miles from Earth, permanently oriented away from our entire inner solar system so it can detect faint heat signatures from galaxies that formed more than 13 billion years ago, has to sacrifice the ability to observe our own closest planetary neighbors as a direct, deliberate consequence of the very design choices that let it peer so much further into the past than any telescope built before it. That trade-off represents genuinely elegant engineering, not some boring technical footnote buried deep in a mission manual. Webb wasn't limited by accident or oversight. It was built this way entirely on purpose, because the scientists and engineers behind the mission decided that peering back toward the dawn of the observable universe was worth permanently giving up the ability to photograph Venus, Mercury, or even Earth itself. There's a broader lesson worth taking away from all of this too, especially since space-related misinformation spreads so easily and so quickly online. A claim doesn't actually need to be true to look thoroughly convincing inside a well-edited video. Dramatic narration, a suitably serious-sounding voice, official-looking graphics, and a thumbnail built from a real, entirely unrelated photograph of Venus can combine to make a completely false claim feel authoritative within the very first 10 seconds of watching. The genuinely good news is that claims exactly like this one are usually quite easy to fact-check. A quick search for what James Webb can and cannot actually observe pulls up direct, plainly worded explanations straight from NASA itself, from established astronomy publications, and from science communicators who have covered this exact recurring topic more than once, precisely because so many of these Venus-themed videos keep resurfacing, and people keep reasonably asking whether they're real. It also helps to consider who genuinely benefits from a video like this earning clicks in the first place. Channels built around this particular kind of content are typically monetized through advertising revenue and total watch time, meaning the underlying incentive isn't necessarily accuracy at all, it's simply engagement. A completely fabricated claim costs essentially nothing to produce, and if the editing is polished enough, it can perform just as well as a genuine story, sometimes noticeably better, since a made-up discovery can be scripted to sound exactly as shocking as its creator wants, with none of the natural constraints that come from honestly reporting on something that actually happened. That doesn't mean every single space channel online is untrustworthy. Plenty do genuinely excellent, well-sourced work, explaining real missions and real findings in clear, accessible language. But it does mean titles built entirely around shock value, especially ones claiming a major space agency achieved something that agency has never actually announced anywhere, deserve an extra moment of honest scrutiny before anyone accepts them as established fact. It's also worth noting this particular myth isn't even a new or isolated pattern. Fake or wildly exaggerated space discovery videos have effectively become their own strange little genre online, recycling real telescope names, genuine mission logos, and authentic background footage, then stitching all of it together around invented claims that were never actually published by any space agency or peer-reviewed scientific journal. Similar false claims have circulated online about Webb supposedly detecting alien signals, capturing detailed images of Earth-like planets that don't exist in any confirmed astronomical catalog, or discovering structures that supposedly violate basic physics entirely. The underlying pattern is almost always identical: a dramatic thumbnail, a serious-sounding narrator, a title engineered specifically to trigger curiosity or alarm, and absolutely no link anywhere in the video description to an actual NASA press release, published scientific paper, or independently verifiable source. Genuine Webb discoveries, by clear contrast, almost always come with a traceable paper trail, a NASA blog post, a peer-reviewed paper published in a journal like Nature or the Astrophysical Journal, or coverage from well-established science outlets that clearly cite exactly where their underlying data actually originated. That gives anyone watching a fairly reliable, repeatable way to sanity check space-related videos going forward. If a claim about Webb or any other major space mission sounds unusually huge or dramatic, it typically takes only a minute or two to check whether NASA, the European Space Agency, or a recognized science outlet has actually reported it independently. Genuine discoveries from a mission as high profile as Webb simply do not remain confined to a single, low-effort video with zero sources attached. They get covered widely, explained directly by the scientists actually involved in the work, and backed by published data anyone curious enough can go verify for themselves. When that entire trail is missing, that absence alone is usually the single biggest clue that a claim was never real to begin with. It's also worth taking a moment to appreciate what Webb has actually delivered in its real body of work, since the true, verified list of achievements is already long enough that nobody needs to invent extra ones. It has shown auroras dancing around Uranus in 3 dimensions for the very first time. It has revealed carbon dioxide present in the atmosphere of a planet orbiting a star far beyond our own solar system. One of the clearest signs yet that studying distant worlds for potential signs of habitable conditions is now genuinely achievable with current technology. It has captured Jupiter's faint rings and glowing polar auroras in a level of detail nobody had access to before Webb came online. It has peered closely at Mars, and returned data scientists are still actively working through years later. And its now famous deep field images, showing thousands of distant galaxies packed into a patch of sky smaller than a single grain of sand held at arm's length, remain among the most staggering pictures any scientific instrument built by humans has ever produced. None of that required a single ounce of exaggeration to be genuinely worth talking about, and none of it, notably, ever involved Venus. There's one more angle worth mentioning, since it explains why this specific myth carries so much more staying power compared to other kinds of space misinformation circulating online. Venus, genuinely and entirely on its own merits, is already a strange and dramatic planet with real, extensively documented facts that sound almost unbelievable without any exaggeration needed whatsoever. Its surface sits at roughly 460 degrees Celsius, easily hot enough to melt lead. And that extreme heat comes not from being closer to the sun than Mercury, which it actually isn't, but instead from a runaway greenhouse effect driven by its thick, crushing atmosphere composed mostly of carbon dioxide. Surface pressure on Venus runs roughly 90 times what we experience here on Earth, comparable to the pressure found nearly a kilometer deep in Earth's own oceans, more than enough to crush most spacecraft and not specifically hardened to withstand it. Its clouds are partly composed of sulfuric acid, and its entire atmosphere circulates around the planet in a matter of just a few days, even though the solid planet underneath rotates so slowly that a single day on Venus technically lasts longer than its entire year around the sun. Given how genuinely bizarre the real, verified facts about Venus already are, it's honestly not surprising that content creators find it such an easy target for dramatic framing. They simply don't need to invent a fake Webb observation to make the planet interesting. The real planet already does that work entirely on its own. So the next time this particular claim resurfaces, and it very likely will, since these videos tend to get reposted and re-edited every few months under slightly different, equally dramatic titles, you'll now have the complete, accurate picture. James Webb sits nearly 1 million miles from Earth, permanently shielded from the sun, the Earth, and everything located near them, deliberately built that way so it can detect faint heat signatures from the very edge of observable time itself. Venus, orbiting close to the sun as it always has and always will, permanently falls inside the exact zone that SHIELD exists specifically to block. No amount of viral editing changes that basic, thoroughly established fact, and no headline claiming otherwise is describing anything that has actually genuinely happened. If you want to see real images of Venus, the genuine footage already exists, captured by missions purpose-built for exactly that job. Venera's grainy surface photographs from decades ago, Parker solar probes, surprising infrared glimpses through the clouds, Magellan's radar-mapped volcanic landscapes, and Akatsuki's ongoing study of that planet's wild, fast-moving atmosphere. Those are the real stories, verified, independently documented, and honestly strange enough entirely on their own without anyone ever needing to make something up.